Alright, finally talking shop about the rule of the octave. In this video, I will introduce 4 recipes that will deepen your understanding and improve your practical skills regarding rule of the octave chord motions, because it is my impression that teachers usually don't milk this device enough and usually waste a lot of methodical potential. So if you think you know the rule of the octave already, this is your video. As always, you can find all shown sheets and extra materials on my Patreon page. The link is in the description below. And now let's get started. If you clicked on that video, then there is a high probability that you already have at least a vague idea about what the rule of the octave actually is, and you probably know that it evolved as a shorthand, rule of thumb or guideline that illustrates common standard harmonizations of primarily stepwise bass motions applied to the major and minor scales, and that it exists in countless slightly different versions depending on the source you consult, and that you should be able to pull off at least one version of them in 3 different positions in all 24 keys. And you know what? I didn't practice a single one of them.
Huh?
Actually, already the term rule in rule of the octave is somewhat misleading, as it suggests a definitive shape, mechanism, or principle. It's not even a set of rules, but more like the attempt to illustrate an abstract continuum of voice leading procedures and common chord combinations regarding primarily dominant progressions, or in more historical terms, local cadences, and thus makes the rule of the octave a crucial historical step towards a functional concept of chord grammar. Although some internet pardiamentisti probably would deny that because they want to see pardiamento as some sort of alternative truth that's been suppressed by the mainstream of functional theories and evil academic institutions. But everybody's got their own reality these days, and one morning you just wake up and there is Wim Winters on the Nikhil Hogan show. For the second time. But let's go back to the rule of the octave. Personally, I find that merely rehearsing and transposing a historical original setting is too limiting, especially when there's parallel octaves in it.
What?
It is my impression that the true methodological potential of the rule of the octave is rarely fully explored and utilized by teachers. Because on the one hand, they often seem to restrict themselves too much to established theory class concepts, or on the other hand, tend to bind themselves too strongly to imaginaries of historical fidelity, which in my opinion is equally problematic, just in a different way. And that's why I would like to make a little video series about some methodical considerations on how to practice rule of the octave elements in a meaningful way. In many cases, the common textbook strategy of connecting chords via the principle of the shortest distance leads to an unidiomatic voice leading of the upper voice. So I guess it makes sense to try to be more flexible with the voice leading in favor for a more specific and expressive melodic shape of the upper voice. And a version in minor, but with a different upper voice leading. My general advice would be to practice rule of the octave motions not throughout the whole scale, but divide that thing into at least 4 digestible syntactical chunks you can memorize and transpose separately, because in a real improv or composition you wouldn't use the whole thing anyway, and sooner or later you will recognize smaller chunks increase the combinatorial flexibility, and that strategy will protect you from that annoying effect that always triggers you to play the whole thing at once, which is not what you want. But let me give you some more examples of what I mean by good melody. First an accurate but lame example, and then the same progression with a more attractive or more idiomatic upper voice. And the same with a more directed melody. And let's do another one like this. And improved version. In this example, you can see that a good melody is somewhat contrapuntally related to the bass, apart from the final chord that shows an octave on the outer voices. All other intervals are imperfect consonances, and for the first four sonorities make even parallel thirds. As mentioned earlier, the most important aspect of the rule of the octave is the demonstration of common dominant progressions on stepwise bass motions, which I consider as the rule's crucial core information. In fact, every common dominant chord of the common rule of the octave can be replaced by a diminished seventh chord, which would be its functional equivalent, but there are some more additional options. Fairly reasonable occasions for placing diminished seventh chords on the scale would as well be the sixth degrees in both directions. In the ascending direction, this would be a predominant, harmonizing the melodic tetrachord leading into the actual dominant, and on the descending direction, a less conventional diminished seventh inversion that could lead into a cadential 6/4. So this modified rule of the octave setting would sound much more suspenseful, and I show you two different versions to demonstrate multiple voice leading options. And the other version. Instead of unconsciously playing the rule of the octave up and down all the time, it makes more sense to break this procedure by mixing up smaller rule of the octave chunks, rearranging them within a metrical framework, and finally closing the phrase with a cadence. So this example entirely consists of rule of the octave progressions, but more like in the sense of a succession of smaller sections or chunks. Not just beginners, but as well a lot of intermediate improvisers struggle with meter and counting especially. So when you're already able to freely connect several chunks, try to do it like in this example and focus on a prescribed meter, in this case 3/4. And this will be much more challenging than you would expect. One could introduce the rule of thumb that every cadence should be performed in such a way that it falls on a strong beat. So whenever you try to improvise a phrase like this, try to anticipate the metrical element of the upcoming cadence, and although you're creating simple music, the outcome will sound pretty much convincing. Maybe you need another example. Already more than a decade ago, the German music theorist and pianist Ludwig Holtmeier proposed a hypothetical rule of the octave with the purpose to highlight the initial contrapuntal origin of the rule's chords that he baptized rule of the octave in the style of Corelli, and thus is realized in a paradigmatic late 17th century trio style. The crucial aspect of Holtmeier's rule is the unifying application of the so-called double cadence as the epitome of Baroque cadences per se, and what he calls Durchkadenzierung der Skala. This illustration is supposed to illuminate the important issue that several of the sonorities that we today use to understand as individual chordal entities originally emerged from dynamic contrapuntal settings as part of bigger chunks, and just at a later historical stage developed into autonomous sonorities as they would appear in the rule of the octave illustrations we're today used to. Most prominently, the pre-cadential 6/5 chord and the descending 4/2 chord are originally derived from a two-voice suspension archetype that could be called the mother of all dissonances. Just let this information sink in for a minute. As I insinuated at the beginning, I guess Holtmeier's rule of the octave is actually not supposed to be played and practiced, but rather more an intellectual or speculative product of theorizing. But I actually think it is a very good idea to as well practically apply general contrapuntal stereotypes onto the scale in a dynamic trio style, with the purpose to teach common dissonant constellations that emerge from suspensions. Because a lot of things that define the language of Baroque music cannot accurately be described and sufficiently conceptualized just in terms of chords, as the abstract progress of this music is mainly driven by the concept of preparing and resolving dissonances, which by nature is a contrapuntal procedure. So I want to share 4 contrapuntal rule of the octave versions that are definitely supposed to be practiced. And the second version. And 2 more minor key versions. Mad props if you made it to this point of the video, so maybe it wasn't entirely uninteresting. If you want to have those materials, check my Patreon, and if you support me already on Patreon, thanks for your money. See you next time.